So kind of going along with that, personality types can influence our communications. You might have somebody that wants to talk everything out, that needs all of the information before they can make a decision. I'm one of those people, are you? I want to know all of my options. I want to know what everything means before I decide what's the best for me and my loved one. But there might be other people who just want to get it done. You know, they care just as much as we do about that circumstance, but they don't need all of that information. In fact, sometimes too much information for certain people is overwhelming, and then they can't make a decision. So we need to remember those things too. As we're communicating with somebody else, their needs might be different than ours based on that personality type. Another one that's, I think, fairly obvious but worth stating is opposing values, right? So while my goal for my parent might be to live, as long as possible based on number of years, their goal might be more about the quality of those years, whether they be long or not. Those are both valid goals, right? And goals that we see all the time. But those opposing values sometimes make for friction within those family relationships especially, but also within provider relationships. Okay? So along those same lines, our goals based on those values might be different. The last one that I really want to go into depth on this slide is emotions. This is the biggest barrier I see to communication of any type, whether it's about caregiving, whether it's in romantic relationships, whether it's with our children, whether it's with coworkers. One of the things that creates the greatest conflict is emotions, right? It's very hard sometimes to remove our emotional self from the situation at hand, particularly with caregiving, right? We're talking about somebody that we love very much, somebody that we have hopes for and fears for, somebody that we've known, most cases, for a long, long time. And it's really hard sometimes to communicate with others and to make decisions when those emotions are running the show. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Another barrier is silence. I talked about that person in the family that maybe doesn't want all of that information. And so they don't say as much. They don't jump in as much because they don't feel the need to find more information, or maybe they don't want to rock the boat. You have anybody around you that's that person? They'll just kind of go along with whatever because they don't want any conflict. I'm guilty of that one sometimes too. A lot of times that silence stops the communication, stops the conversations that we need to be having. And so that's something that we'll touch on a little bit too. What do you do with that person? Maybe that's silent in the decision-making process. So any questions about those before I go on, or any that you would like to add? This is by no means a definitive list. There's all kinds of barriers, but these are all pretty common ones. So what do you do with that? You have these folks that you just don't seem to be on the same page as. You have these people that, I talk and talk and talk and he doesn't seem to hear me. Or, I try to do my best and then she comes out of the blue with something that we hadn't even talked about before. Again, remember, we can't change that person, right? What we can do is try to enhance the way that we communicate. And so that's what I would like to talk with you guys now about, how you can make your communication as effective as possible. Because the hope is that when we're communicating better, the response that we get back from them is enhanced communication as well. So the first tip I have for us as we're enhancing that communication is to make sure that we're using I statements. Has anybody heard that phrase before? Yeah. I probably should have mentioned up front that my background is as a mental health therapist, and so this is one that I use all the time. You know why? Because we can all do it. There's no magic in this, but sometimes really making sure we stick to this can feel a little bit magical in its outcome. So what I mean when I say I statements is that instead of focusing on the other person or focusing on the conflict in the situation, what we want to do is talk about ourselves. That seems a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? We want to make sure that we're talking about facts and how they relate to us, how we are affected by that situation. So instead of saying things like, you always make me feel like I don't do enough. Ooh, how would you feel if I said that to you, Barry? Yeah. You hush. I'm not doing anything to you, right? We would change it to something like, when you tell me that Mom's hair is a mess, I feel that I'm not doing enough to care for her. How do you feel when I say that? It's still not an easy thing to listen to, is it? But suddenly that bit of blame is removed, right? Already up front, just by using this I statement, just by changing my wording a little bit, I'm still expressing the same thing, but you're hearing it totally different, aren't you?
What
Yeah.
are the facts you're dealing with?
We'll get to that in a second. He asked me what are the facts that I'm dealing with. So, for instance, in this statement, you've told me that Mom's hair is a mess. Most people can't dispute that. If you said it to me, it's a fact, right? Mom's hair may not be a mess, but the fact is that you've said that to me.
Okay.
And here's how I feel based on it. So I'm no longer telling you it's your fault that I feel this way, but what I am saying is here's the factual situation that happened, and here's my reaction to it. Let's talk about that. Does that make sense? Such a simple tweak, isn't it? Such a big effect. So here's the slide that you were asking me about. This is where we need to be very aware of emotions. Emotional statements and communication often breed defensiveness, sometimes aggressive reactions, or sometimes people closing down completely, right? So what we want to do is make sure that we're pulling that emotional filter out, that we're focusing on that fact. So, fact. Mom has fallen twice this year. We can count that, right? We know if that's fact. A feeling would be, I'm so worried about Mom, or Mom's not safe at home. I just don't feel like she's going to do okay there. You know, those things might be valid points, but the way that we talk about them makes a difference. Okay? Dealing with facts rather than feelings, too, also gets us to a specific goal. If we can talk about Mom falling, that's a goal we can work on. If we can talk about me being worried about Mom, perhaps we can work on my worry, but we're really not helping Mom much, right? So let's try another one. Grandpa has not spoken at one doctor's appointment this year. We can look at that fact, right? If his mouth hasn't opened, that's a fact. Grandpa wouldn't want it this way. Often family members interpret reactions of the person being cared for, or the physician can interpret that, you know what, you're okay with everything I'm saying here because you haven't disagreed with me yet. When really we don't know. We don't know about that person. So we need to stick to those facts. So the last one, doctor says that Dad should no longer drive. That's a fact. This is one we talked about with Rachel last year. A lot of people will call me and say, I don't think my dad should be driving, but I'm his daughter. I can't tell him what to do. Well, yeah, you can. Maybe you don't really want to because things are going to get really ugly around home. So let's not focus on that fact, or that feeling. Let's focus on the fact instead. Got it? All right. So we're sticking to the facts. We're talking about their effect on us with those I statements. Another key to enhancing our personal communication is reflective listening. This is another one of those things that we talk about a lot in counseling, but I think are really, important skills to know in just our general relationships. So what reflective listening means is making sure that the other person in that communication relationship knows that you're listening to them too. So I'm going to do my best to clearly get my point across, but I also want you to know that I'm hearing your point as well, right? Unfortunately, it's not just about us in most communication relationships. Otherwise, things would be quite easy. So we need them to know by our words and our actions that they know, I hear you too, okay? So instead of Yeah.
So the reflecting is the listener,
Yes.
the primary listener is the reflector?
Yes. His question was, is the primary listener the reflector? Hopefully, in any communication, you're both doing this. But I'm talking sort of at you, since you're the ones that I can influence here. So with reflective listening, it really should be a two-way street, but should's kind of a dangerous word, right? So with reflective listening, we want to not only tell them, I hear you, kind of go through those motions that, yes, we are listening. But what we really want to do is use some of the content of what they're saying to know we have the meaning of it too. So, saying something like, what I'm hearing you say is that you are overwhelmed and would like some help getting Dad to and from appointments. So, I've left it pretty clear that here's what I got out of your message. I might not be right, but if I'm doing reflective listening, they can tell that I'm at least working on coming up with what their meaning is, right? So they might say, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Can you help me with that? Or the response might be, that's not what I'm talking about at all. But again, even if we're wrong when we're using that reflection, the conversation moves forward in a way that is collaborative rather than contentious, I guess, for lack of a better word there. So let's try another one. So although you don't like the idea of a nursing home, you'd be supportive if Mom is no longer able to bathe herself adequately. Am I hearing you correctly? That's kind of a magical question too. Listen, I'm trying to get this. I'm trying to work with you. Did I get it right? Right? Because then the ball's in your court. You can tell me how you're feeling because I want to hear it. People are so much more likely to not only try to hear what you're saying, but also to want to be collaborative with you. If you show them, I'm trying to be a part of the team, right? Whether I get it right or not is not the real issue when you're communicating. What's the real issue is that we're trying to get to the same place. Okay? I like to stick to to-dos, but there are some do-nots. Please be careful of absolutes. These words up here, always, never, completely, all, forever, those are dangerous words. They're very black and white, and they tend to be kind of challenging. When someone says to you, you never, blah, 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 how do you react?
Think of one.
You can think of one?
No, you think of one that...
Oh, right. You always think of the exception. What was that I heard from somewhere else? Barry, was that you? Defensive, right. The gloves come out. The walls go up. You don't know what I always and never do, right? Get that head going. You get mad. Avoid these words. Here's the one time we'll use always. Always avoid these words. Because they typically do not lead to a collaborative place. They typically lead to a place of contention or withdrawal. Another thing is that communication may not always end in the exact place we want it to end. Sometimes we need to compromise. So when you're at a place where you can't quite agree with the doc, or you can't quite agree with the caregiver, or the brother, or the dad, or whomever, ask yourself, what could you concede and live with it? Is there something you could give up to keep this collaboration going that isn't going to kill you? It may not be the perfect way you want it, but could you live with it? I really don't want to give up, having my mom not dressed to the nines for church, but it's killing everybody to get her out of the house. Could I just say, oh God, Mom probably wouldn't like this, but we're going to church without makeup this week? Would it kill you? Would it kill her? Probably not. So, is there something that you would give up in order to get your way on something else? I think this is a great way to compromise. Can we trade off on this? All right, I'll let you make the decision about which caregiver we use, if I can make the decision about, what we do at bath time. I don't know, whatever the case may be. And then the third question to ask yourself, if you're still not coming up with anything, is it worth the battle? Are you worth going to war with somebody to get your way on this? Sometimes the answer to that is yes. And if it is, go to battle, right? Yeah, but sometimes the answer is, no, it's just kind of the way I want it, right? We talked a little bit about silence before, and when I work with families, I always like to set a few ground rules, and one of those ground rules that I like to set is that we need to be very careful of silence, because it can be easy to think, oh, great, we worked everything out, and really somebody's stewing in the background, not talking about things because they feel they haven't been heard. So I always say to my families, and perhaps you can when working with folks too, that silence is consent. If you're not speaking up, I'm assuming you're okay with the way things are, okay? So if you don't like the way things are going, I want to hear you. Speak up, because no one is a mind reader, right? And it's easier to just say, oh, must be fine, and move on. Oops, sorry. It's a little bit behind. Also, if we are truly wanting to enhance communication, we need to make sure that we're encouraging opposing points of view, right? I don't like to always hear people argue with me. I go home to visit my parents, and we are worlds apart when it comes to certain political views. So what we mostly do is choose not to talk about it, right? But some of the best conversations and some of the most eye-opening conversations I've had about politics are when I actually did say, tell me, why do you think that? I'm not always convinced, but sometimes I am. Sometimes I am. And I think it really opens up our perspective and our ability to be good caregivers if we're hearing all sides of the story. So although this is a really hard one, it gets us the most informed decision. And really, since everybody's being heard, we're having the greatest overall satisfaction when we do have a decision that we've made together. And the last thing I would say is to show your appreciation and gratitude. If somebody ends a pretty tough conversation with me and says, you know what, I really appreciate that you felt like you could say that to me. Even if we didn't agree, I feel like, oh, they kind of valued what I had to say. I may or may not have gotten my way, so to speak. But the more that we can show that appreciation and gratitude, the less we're going to get that silence, the less we're going to get of those walls.